In this video I will show you how to get from basic looking thumbnails like this to better ones like that. I'm gonna give you a step-by-step guide on how to improve the quality of your thumbnails by following some simple steps and tricks, even if you have no artistic capabilities and skills just like me. Now you might be wondering what qualifies me to do this kind of video if I don't have any art skills myself. Well, nothing. Except that I don't have any noteworthy art skills myself, like probably most people out there, but still create decent looking thumbnails, which should tell you if you follow these simple steps, you can do it yourself as well. The reason why I'm doing this is that I actually play in a Pokemon Draft League with a lot of content creators, and I see most of them do the same mistakes on their thumbnails like over and over again, and I want to provide some help on how to fix these. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing as it helps a lot, and I'm pretty close to hit my first big goal of 100 subscribers on the channel, so you could be the one that makes a difference and I would greatly appreciate. So if you enjoy this video, leave a like and a subscription to always stay up to date with the latest content. Since you're watching this video, I assume you already have some basic knowledge of how to create a thumbnail in a photo editing software of your choice, such as GIMP or Photoshop. In this video I will be using GIMP because it's free and open source and I actually enjoy working in it. We are going to recreate a thumbnail from one of my previous videos, and as you can see I already have a sort of template for this kind of videos in place. So let me just walk you briefly through what is present in the template. There is 7 different layers. In the upper left corner there's a small text describing the type of battle we are going to see. In the upper right and lower left corner there's the team names of the teams present in the video and their logos respectively. Last but not least, there's an overlay separating the image in 2 halves. The first step when creating a thumbnail always is to nail down our composition. To do this, I often start out by gathering all the potential elements I want to include in my thumbnail, and then I proceed with roughly cutting them up and put them in place until I'm happy. The important part is to achieve a layout and structure that you're happy with while not overloading your thumbnail. A good trick to make the composition look more interesting is to rotate the main elements a bit. This brings more motion into the picture and looks more natural. When you are composing your thumbnail, you should pay attention to some of those details. Have a story to tell. It can be a quite simple story, such as the one in my example, where I have a fire type Pokemon, battle an ice type Pokemon, and the video is called A Song of Fire and Ice. It is not complex at all, but it creates a small story and a certain type of tension. Try to clearly separate the foreground from the background, as it will help highlight more important elements. Do not include too much text on your thumbnail. This is among the mistakes that I see the most. Your thumbnail should be narrating a story by the principle of show, don't tell, because you already have a title to tell. The next hint ties in perfectly fine with this, as it is, do not repeat the title in your thumbnail. A lot of YouTubers do this and it's actually not pretty useful, as there's no new information gained for the viewer and they can't judge whether this video would be of any interest for them. On the opposite side, if you have an appealing looking thumbnail, a viewer might say, hey, this looks interesting and better than the other ones with a lot of text on them, so I want to click it. It is of course okay to include some text on your thumbnails. For example, if you have a how-to series on how to bake cakes, for example, then you could put the text how to cake on all of your videos in that series, just to make clear they are from that series. The next hint also is a critical one and a mistake that many YouTubers do, and I also often do myself. Do not overload your thumbnail. If you have too many elements on your thumbnail, it will become unreadable, the story will be not clear anymore, and you'll just end up with a mess that nobody wants to click on. As a rule of thumb, I always try to limit myself to 3 to 5 elements per thumbnail, but the fewer the better. And the last hint that I have for your composition is always keep in mind that the actual thumbnail will be quite small. While working on it, you are viewing your thumbnail in full screen. However, it is important to zoom out from time to time to judge whether your thumbnail still does what it should be doing and achieve the results that you hope it would. The second step actually is quite small, and it's the clear cutting stage. So if I have a lot of different elements, I now proceed with cutting them. This one can be a little time consuming depending on how complex the elements are, but usually you don't need to be 100% accurate because the actual thumbnail size is indeed quite forgiving. In GIMP, I simply use the free select tool to match the element's shape, cut and paste them onto a new layer. And as you can see, I'm simply using the rough cut that I prepared earlier, and then simply add some details to the cut until I get rid of all the unnecessary parts. The third step is applying filters. Filters are a key part to make the foreground elements pop. In this stage, we will finally polish the look of our thumbnails by adding some filters that are guaranteed to make your hero props pop more. Hero props are the elements on your thumbnail that are important and the ones that actually tell the most parts of the story. In my case, hero props are often funny looking faces of myself, or a Pokemon that played a specific role in the gameplay. For you, it might be the new product that you are reviewing, or the cake that you just baked, or the food that you prepared, or whatever. Simply determine what your hero prop is and try to make it pop. I almost always use the exact same subset of filters for all my thumbnails: saturation, sharpen, and a drop shadow and or outlines. First and foremost, we are going to play around with the saturation. This one is pretty easy. Simply go to the color drop down in the upper menu bar, select saturation, and then play around with it until you achieve results that satisfy you. I often use a multiplier of 1.5 for foreground elements to make them more shiny and look less washed out. Contrary to that, I tend to use 0.75 to 0.5 saturation for any backgrounds, especially if they are colorful. This will help separating foreground and background further and achieve a more polished look in the end. Especially considering the size of the thumbnail, this will greatly help to make it pop a little more. Don't worry if it doesn't look too well when viewing the image full screen. If you scale it down, it's gonna make a huge difference. Also, it is often better to overdo and exaggerate with these kind of effects, because they have a completely different impact once you see it in the actual size. My personal rule of thumb is, if it looks shitty in full screen, it's gonna look awesome in its actual size. Secondly, we got to sharpen the images. In order to do this, go to Filters, select Enhance, Sharpen, and then start playing around with the values. This filter will sharpen the edges of your elements and make it look less blurry. It is a great filter to use for any important foreground elements, especially if you messed with their scale and they became a little blurry. Applying this sharpen filter will automatically make them pop a lot more, especially once you see it in the actual size. I strongly encourage you to play around with the values of this filter and figure out what works best for you and for which elements. Lastly, we got drop shadows, and their purpose is to make elements stand out from the background. Usually you'd want to apply this to your 1 to 2 most important elements to make them more apparent to the potential viewer, additionally to all the other filters. As with the sharpen filter, simply go to Filters, select Light and Shadows, and then Drop Shadow. And as you can see, there's quite some values to fiddle around with, such as the opacity of the shadow, the glow radius, or its color and the offset. I often use a deep black as a contrast to colorful foreground elements with quite a high glow radius, etc. There's no default setting I can recommend to you, as it highly depends on the actual elements. If they are similar in shape and size, you might be able to reuse shadows that you already applied to other elements, and I also tend to use similar shadow settings for similar type of elements. For instance, I create a lot of competitive Pokemon battle content, so I often include a Pokemon in one way or the other on my thumbnails. Since they are the same type, being a Pokemon, I always use the same drop shadow settings for all of them. However, this depends on your type of content, of course. Just try to fiddle with them and settle on some good defaults for you. As with all the other filters, rather overdo it than underdo it. You will notice that a big chunky drop shadow is almost required to still create the kind of popping feeling for the element. If you have a subtle one, you will barely notice it. Those are all the steps I personally go through whenever I create a thumbnail, but we are not done yet. And of course, these steps may vary depending on the type of thumbnail that you create. But after creating more than 100 thumbnails, I realized that I always did at least these 3 steps. Sometimes, especially when you're doing more fancy stuff, you might need to add some additional filters or steps. Next up, I prepared 10 tips that should guide you to create better looking thumbnails. Number 1 is having a good separation of fore and background, and I mentioned this earlier but I can't stress it enough. If you don't separate them well, you won't be able to make your foreground elements pop, and hence you won't be able to clearly communicate what you want to communicate to your viewers. My second tip is keeping it simple. And this mainly means having no more than 3 elements. Trying to limit the amount of elements in your thumbnails will automatically make them more readable and prevent you from doing overly complex things. The best thumbnails are the simplest ones. Avoid reserved areas. This one can be a little tricky if you don't pay attention to it. YouTube thumbnails are usually shown in the same places, for example when you search for a video or get recommendations. No matter where they are, there are some reserved areas, which YouTube uses to put some additional information onto the thumbnail. For example, the duration of the video or watch later icons. These actively block the vision onto your thumbnail, so it's best to avoid putting relevant elements into these areas. Use dedicated images for your hero props. Now, I already mentioned hero props, and your most important elements are those so-called hero props. And you want them to look as good, crisp and clean as possible. To ensure that, always take dedicated shots for them. For example, if you're running a gaming channel about Call of Duty and you've done a guide on a weapon, don't just take a random cut out of the weapon from a gameplay sequence that you already recorded. Rather go ahead and record a B-roll footage with a dedicated shot, for example a 10-second still in one of the menus where you can clearly see the weapon that you're making a guide of, just so you can get a clean version of the weapon for your thumbnail. Applying your filters in the correct order. This one matters because they actually affect each other. This means that if you add a drop shadow to your hero prop and then change the saturation, you will also change the saturation of the drop shadow. Because of that, you should think of the filters you're going to use ahead of time and apply them in the correct order. Settle on defaults and templates. This one can save you a ton of time. If you want to work on your brand and establish a certain look, which you should, then this is especially important. If all your thumbnails got nothing in common, no one's gonna be able to tell they are of your video. Try to group videos in a series and create similar looking thumbnails for them. This could be style that is similar, the structure of the thumbnails that is similar, or even something completely different. For instance, I played in a Pokemon Draft League and all my matches for that Draft League use the exact same template, so my viewers can immediately see, oh, that's a Draft League battle. Work with presets in your editing software. You're going to use the same effects with the same settings over and over and over again. Save yourself some hassle and go ahead and create a preset that allows you to configure the settings once and use them whenever you want them. Make sure to use descriptive names so you don't hate yourself in the future. Don't always do the same thing. While the previous 2 tips were about doing the same things over and over again, this one is the opposite. You should also try to incorporate some variety in your thumbnails, or they will all look the same, which is obviously not good. So from time to time, try to mix things up and keep them fresh. Prepare a library of reference images. This one is another tip that can save you a lot of time when working on creating new thumbnails. In order to create thumbnails, you will almost always use a composition of various images. Looking and searching for them can be a pretty time-consuming task, so if you want to save some time, just compile a library of reference images. Those can be images of yourself with different moods, expressions, etc., or actual images of things that you want to incorporate in your thumbnails. Use Google filters to find images fitting the right license. Having to find the right picture already is a hard thing. Not breaking any laws is even harder. Luckily, Google allows you to filter for licenses, so you can pick whichever suits your use case best and then start narrowing down the search. As a little bonus, I got an 11th and last tip, which would be work on separate layers. Thank me later. But seriously, you will start noticing that this makes a big difference. All your elements in the thumbnail are on a separate layer. It's going to be much easier to mess with the actual structure and layout of your thumbnail, and you can mix things up way faster. Hopefully you are now more than ready to create awesome looking thumbnails, and if this video was useful for you, please consider subscribing to help me achieve that 100 subscriber goal. That would be greatly appreciated. Also, if you have more tips to share, make sure to include them as a comment below this video. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.